Chapter 10. Spreading My Wings. Just 13 years old, I was a tall girl for my age, and even on my limited budget, and even though I say so myself, I looked pretty sexy when I was dressed up for a night on the town. My closest friends and I easily got into clubs where the bouncers were more interested in the cleavage we were showing than in checking our IDs to ensure we were the requisite 18 plus. Distracting the doormen was not the reason I wore clubbing clothes, revealing a lot more than they concealed, but it certainly helped at the entrance. One favorite haunt was West London's biggest club, the famous Hammersmith Palais, sadly now demolished, but in its time a great place for dancing. We rarely paid to get in because on many club nights entry was free before 10 o'clock, and we would slip in a few moments before the deadline, clutching handbags in which were hidden small bottles of gin for me and Pernod and Southern Comfort for Jennifer, still then my closest friend. The doormen were only really interested in searching the guys for anything dangerous, like knives. We had so few clothes on that they would have had trouble searching us anyway without being accused of indecent assault, so we invariably got away with our mini smuggling operation. It meant that a few soft drink mixers were our only expense for the evening. Jennifer was always keen to get guys to buy us drink, but I was rarely interested in the men. I was there to drink and dance, and with the exception of the occasional kiss, I was always well behaved. The club had box-like raised platforms on which you could dance, and Jennifer and I would monopolize one of these for the night and dance our hearts out. One picture taken around that time shows me in tight black shorts and wearing a gold bum bag, all the rage at the time. I'm not sure I was ever a great dancer, but I just loved those nights, dancing for hours and eyeing up the talent, even if I was not particularly interested in the talent taking things any further. In fact, I rarely got chatted up at the club nights. I immodestly thought I was the prettiest girl in the group, but I must have been giving out "I want to be alone" signals because I was so shy. I just got on with the dancing, fending off the occasional bad chat-up line from unattractive guys whom I would never have wanted to be with in a million years. I always seemed to attract the weird ones. I've been told many times since that I do have an unapproachable air about me that deters men from trying to chat. If that's the case, it's ironic that I spend my days now surrounded by men who kneel at my feet, profess to worship the ground I walk on, and constantly crave my attention. Perhaps treat them mean, keep them keen really does work. After all, if you're going to do the job properly, then clubbing takes a lot of energy, and long hours late into the night, just the sort of energy levels we possess in our early teens. I was unstoppable when I was having fun. The downside, of course, was that dancing till the early hours isn't conducive to waking up bright and breezy for school in the morning. On top of that, at the age of 13 or 14, I was often trying to get home late at night from some pretty seedy parts of London, and it is no surprise that my desire for independence was giving my elderly grandparents nightmares. The irony is that, at least at that age, I truly was not doing anything naughty on my nights out, and they really could have slept easily in their beds. Both Nan and Granddad were, however, convinced that I must be meeting men, and would undoubtedly end up being raped or worse, although I was never quite certain what the worse might entail. It was a typical clash of the generations, with me testing their boundaries and my grandparents struggling constantly to rein me in. The only difference in this case was that the game had skipped a generation. Where I should have been pushing against someone of my birth mother's age, I was struggling against parents of a generation once removed. It was a recipe for seemingly endless conflict and eventual disaster. As my rows with Nan and Granddad escalated, they began to despair of having any control over me. Looking back on it now, I must have been a nightmare for them. I was no longer listening to anything they said. I was rude, disrespectful, had a tendency to slam doors on my way up to my room, where I would pump my music up loud in the certain knowledge that the noise would drive them crazy. I'm not proud of my behavior then, and I am so glad that when I had eventually matured enough to realize what a shit I had been, I was able to apologize to them before they died for putting them through the hell of my teenage years. Through it all, as I think they always understood, I did carry on loving them. It was just that they were of such a different generation that their rules seemed stricter, their curfews earlier, and their ideas more outdated than those of any of my friends' parents. Although I had long known that they were my adoptive parents, rather than my birth parents, I've never believed that was a deciding factor in our relationship. The related age gap that went with that situation seems to me to have been a more relevant concern, but it may well have influenced the way that my grandparents thought of me and their responsibilities to bring me up as a decent girl who could be trusted to be safely in her bed each night rather than gallivanting around in clubs. Having willingly embraced the role of parents, could it be that they felt even more duty-bound than real parents to keep me safe? Apart from the relatively harmless drinking, nothing happened on those club nights that would have worried my grandparents anyway if they had come along with me. But just on principle, my nan worried incessantly about me being out with friends late at night. After endless rows that were getting us nowhere, my birth mother and her husband got involved and actually tried to act as peacemakers. Her husband would sometimes drive over from their home, 30 miles or so outside London, and stay the night in order that he could pick me up from the club in his car and see me home safely. I think it was my birth mother's attempt to help me, because she privately felt that my grandparents were just too strict about everything, but having legally given me away to them in the adoption, she had no authority to control what I was or was not doing. My case to be allowed to go out late was also helped by one particularly kind taxi driver who would make a point of waiting for me and my best friend on club evenings. He refused other fares just to take us home and told us, "I've got a daughter of my own and I want to know that she gets home safely." He always undercharged us for the fare and had no ulterior motive of any kind for helping us. Just a genuinely nice man. For a while, the compromises calmed down the situation between myself and my grandparents a little, but the rows over my independence continued. Over the next 18 months, as I grew ever more determined to lead my own life, the arguments were scheduled to get worse, much, much worse. Chapter 11. First Love. From my earliest teenage years, about the time I discovered that I could get really fun feelings in my lady bits if I wiggled my fingers in just the correct way, I grew more and more interested in all types of fetish imagery. I think Madonna the singer, not the religious icon, has a lot to answer for in turning a generation of young girls onto rubber, leather, and conical brass. I was drawn to her music videos and to magazine images of her outfits. I found I was browsing through any newspaper stories that dealt with fetish items, whether they were on the fashion pages or from a sex story in the news of the world. It was clear that from this early age I was interested in such fetish material, although I've never really thought to ask why. I'm not a reflective, self-analytical person in that way. I'm more the type who will think, well, that worked for me. Now, what else can I find? My own fashion sense was limited to what I could afford, which was never much, but from about the age of 13 seemed to always be the girl wearing the shortest, tightest skirts in any group. My dress sense may have been outrageous, but I was still shy and retiring, and despite the occasional sexual foray, I was soon approaching my 15th birthday relatively chaste, and certainly with no regular boyfriend. I knew I wanted to explore some of the sexually exciting fetish imagery I enjoyed, but had no one with whom I could play. Then I met my first love, and my sex life exploded in all sorts of fascinating new directions. Tom was 6 feet 2 inches tall, dark-haired, and must have inherited some of his good looks from his attractive mother. He was from a distinctly middle-class family, living in a posher part of West London. I fancied him like crazy from the moment I saw him. With that overwhelming passion of young love, I immediately thought, he's tall, brown-haired, stocky but fit, a nice guy from a nice family. This is the man I will spend the rest of my life with. Tom was the first guy I really fancied, as opposed to the few other guys I had slept with. where sex had just sort of happened with little thought or desire on my part. I met him through a friend who was going out with his brother and then spent an afternoon after school with him and some friends in his bedroom. Nothing happened between us, but I was really impressed with the fact that he had proper graffiti sprayed all over the white walls and that he and his friends were smoking puff. I think I had taken pills at clubs before, but that was my introduction to any sort of drugs culture. When I got to know the family better, I learned that his parents had split, and that since then his mother had rather lost control of her sons. It was odd, because I remember thinking that they were from a middle-class background, in a posh house, and were spraying graffiti on their walls and using drugs, whereas I was poor and from a council estate, but would never had dreamt of behaving like that. The afternoon we met up, everyone was chatting, although as usual I was the quiet one of the group. Before then, I had never seen the Monty Python film Life of Brian, but one of Tom's friends put on the video, and I found it utterly hilarious. Perhaps fueled by the puff we were all smoking, I was in pain from laughing so much, and I was getting on really well with Tom's friend, which didn't go down too well with him. The next time I saw him, he left me in no doubt that, although he was again with a group of friends, I was the one in whom he was interested. I'm sure we must have had our first kiss that night, although I can remember very little about the evening, because the guys took us to a pub and got me completely and utterly drunk. They were buying me gin, and I just couldn't handle spirits like that. It was mortifying to go home with Tom and to have his mother find me pissed out of my mind. There was no way I could go home in that state, and so she let me stay the night. It was my first night in my new boyfriend's house, but any idea of naughty games was out of the question. I actually spent the entire night throwing up in their toilet and being looked after by his mother. By morning, just wanted to die. It's an ill wind, however, that blows nobody good, and there was to be a happy outcome from my out-of-character night of drunken behavior. Tom's mum had telephoned my grandmother to explain that I wasn't really well enough to go home, and that she was happy for me to stay in their spare bedroom. The next morning, she drove me home and met my nan, who was impressed by the fact she had a car, and was totally reassured that I had been safe for the night. They swapped telephone numbers, and Tom's mum said I would always be welcome to stay over at their house in the future. I was deeply ashamed and embarrassed by what had happened, but it did mean that forever after that I could tell my grandparents I was staying at Tom's house, and they believed me every time. So Tom became my first love, and we started exclusively dating each other. He went to the local all-boys school, and I was at the girls' equivalent, so we took to traveling home on the bus together several nights a week, and then mostly just hanging out in his room. I fancied him from the start, and we started having sex almost immediately. The first time with him was in his own bed at his house while his mum was out at work. His grandmother lived with the family, and she was in the house at the time, but luckily for us, was a bit deaf. For the first time, really enjoyed the sex, and it became important and fun for me. From then onwards, there was no holding us back. I would see Tom several times a week, and at weekends sometimes staying the night and sometimes not. I had no worries about getting pregnant because I had been prescribed the pill a year earlier, not as a contraceptive, but as a treatment for my acne. It was a really effective acne cure, and I ended up being prescribed 3 monthly contraceptive injections. For the same reason, they stopped my periods completely, as well as removing the fear of an unwanted baby. With that freedom, boy, I really fancied, and a bed where we could have plenty of privacy, I became something of a sex maniac. I could hardly keep my hands off of Tom's body, and I was usually the instigator when we were going to have sex. My sex drive seemed to be extremely high because I liked him so much. As far as I can remember, I did have orgasms through masturbation before I met Tom, but certainly not with any other men. Now, found I could come if I rode on top of him, although no other position worked in the same way for me. As a result, I was always trying to arouse him so that I could, literally, jump on top of him in bed. It was a long time later that I realized that he was not the best endowed man on the block, but in my relative innocence size truly didn't matter to me at that age. He was large enough to make me happy. Even though I was the one doing the jumping, Tom enjoyed the sex just as much as I did. He was younger than me, and I was also his first regular girlfriend. He always claimed that he wasn't a virgin when he met me, but I think he was lying. I certainly told a few white lies of my own, assuring him that I had only ever had sex with one man before. I thought the truth of several different partners, including the two men who shared my virginity between them, might be too much for him to take. Given the regularity of our sex, it's not surprising that we started to explore our own desires more and more, and I was soon leading Tom into sexual areas that had always interested me. Me being the one on top was our regular sexual position, and it seemed only natural to pin his arms back against the bed as I rode him. It excited me enormously, and he certainly didn't object. Then, because I was always the one taking the lead, I tied his hands to the bedhead. Since we both had started out wearing our school uniforms before various items were discarded as superfluous to requirements, it seemed only natural to use both our school TIs as my very first pieces of bondage equipment. In time I got hold of some rope, and I did try tying him up properly to the bed. Looking back now, can see what a terrible bondage job I did, but we both enjoyed it. At the time, I think that Tom was a little like a rabbit caught in the headlights, fascinated by what was rushing towards him and unable to move away. From there, we graduated onto other domination experiments, always with me in charge of proceedings. One evening, brought some ice into the bedroom, blindfolded him, and started rubbing it over his sensitive parts. He was going crazy underneath me, half enjoying the experience and half hating it. I just thought it was so interesting that he could still feel horny and excited despite the discomfort I was causing. It was perhaps the first time that I realized that I hugely enjoyed having power over another helpless human being. It's a power I've enjoyed ever since. A power to be used responsibly and, at times, tempered by kindness, but it is a highly addictive feeling I love to this day. I suspected even then that I was a step ahead of my peers in my sexual activities, but never felt guilty about it. They probably weren't tying their boyfriends to the bed, but to me, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. As time went by, Tom and I grew bolder in arranging for me to stay the night in his bed. As far as my grandparents were concerned, Tom's mom was happy for me to stay over at her house in the spare room. As far as Tom's mother was concerned, I was leaving most evenings to go home. The truth was that we were busily deceiving both of them. At the end of the evening, I would say goodbye to Tom's family, and he would then offer to walk me to the nearby bus stop. We knew that while we were out, the whole family would go off to bed, making it easy for him to sneak me back into the house and upstairs to his bedroom. They were having work done to the house, and so for a long while there was scaffolding around the building. That made it even easier for me to shimmy up the scaffold poles after I had supposedly left to go home and climb back and through the bedroom window. In the morning, would simply leave by the same route whilst everyone was getting up, and then a few minutes later turn up at the door to visit Tom again. Morning, sleep well? Good to see you. In the end, of course, I got caught out. I was so tired one morning that I let Tom go off to school on his own whilst I stayed put in his bed. I thought I had locked the door, but his mother caught me out. It didn't go down too well to find me asleep in her son's bed, but the relationship had lasted for so long by then that she hardly made any fuss. The love affair with Tom had led to a temporary truce in my fights with my grandparents. But 18 months down the line, as with many first loves, cracks were starting to appear in our relationship. The end was nigh, and the end of one relationship was to rekindle all of the problems in the relationship with my own family. The real war of independence was about to break out at home, and it was not going to end well. Chapter 12. Going off the rails. I knew Tom was lying when he told me he'd had a quiet weekend at home. I'd already heard that he and his mates had been to a local club and, in a way which was starting to typify our friendship, he hadn't wanted to take me along. He always said that having me with him on a night out meant that he couldn't relax in the same way as if he was on his own. As far as I knew, Tom was not being unfaithful to me, but a clear pattern was emerging. It seemed that I was good enough for him to use for sex during the week, but at the weekends, he wanted to go clubbing with his mates, a routine that usually involved varying degrees of drug taking. I felt hurt and rejected. As I rather crudely put it to one of my friends, I'm alright for fucking but not to be seen on his arm. We were going out together less and less, and although our sex life remained strong, we were obviously nearing the end. Having caught him out in one blatant lie, was happy to go along with a girlfriend when she suggested our own Saturday night out at my old haunt of the Hammersmith Palais. Earlier in my teens, I had been Miss Goody Two-Shoes when it came to men and late-night clubs. This time I was in the mood to be naughty. The guy who chatted to me in the club that night was tall, dark-haired, handsome, and well-dressed. As I later learned, he had a thing for designer label clothes, although, then and now, that is the last thing in the world likely to impress me. Having little money myself for most of my childhood, I couldn't understand the appeal of wasting £50 and upwards on a t-shirt. He was about my own age, a little older than my neglectful boyfriend, and things soon got a little out of hand as we danced. After a few more drinks I ended up doing something I'd never done before or since. I had drunken sex with him in a toilet cubicle. It was not the most memorable sex of my life, and all I can really remember is people laughing, whooping, and hollering encouragement outside the door. It made quite a commotion until suddenly the bouncers cottoned on that something untoward was underway and duly kicked us out of the club. It was not quite a one-night stand. I did see him a few more times, but the affair came to a crashing halt one evening when, out of the blue, he decided to bite my bum in bed. It was not a gentle love bite. This was a full-blown bite on my arse cheeks that had me yelling in pain. It was the end of a not-so-beautiful friendship. In the meantime, Tom and I had endured a painful true confessions evening when he admitted various lies to me, and I came clean about my nightclub fling. I hadn't intended to hurt him so much, but I am both a terrible liar and terrible at keeping secrets from anyone. It was a little selfish, I know, but if I have a guilty conscience, then I always have to ease it by telling the truth. I felt so hard done by because of the way he had refused to take me out, but I felt bad because he just looked destroyed from the moment the words left my mouth. Understandably, he said he could end "T.be with me anymore, and although we tried to struggle on together for a while, it was clearly the end of our relationship. I was sorry to lose him, but such childhood romances do have their natural time span, and this one's time had come. There was a bittersweet postscript to my long friendship with Tom. Despite our later problems, he had been my first love and the first man to awaken my sexual desires. He had helped shape the fetish and domination interests which have lasted throughout my life. I'd had boyfriends after him, but nobody special, and then, more than 3 years late, I heard he had asked a friend how I was. I couldn't resist giving him a call. The result was a second 6-week-long fling of sex with your ex, which was exciting and fun. With new experiences under my belt, I also realized that he was not the best endowed man in the world, and that his cock, which once had been the center of my world, was distinctly smaller than others I had known. Of course, being the kind lady that I am, kept that opinion very much to myself, and to be fair to him, the size of his penis didn't stop me wanting to jump all over him again. We had a lot of conversation to catch up on, and I felt our renewed friendship was worthwhile and strong. It was not, however, to last. Our second time around relationship came to an unhappy halt on a Valentine's Day when Tom turned up at my door armed with the requisite chocolates and flowers. As the evening wore on, a minor disagreement suddenly turned into a serious row, and he announced that he no longer wanted to see me. The shock and my anger made me lose my normal, ladylike demeanor. "What the fuck are you doing?" I demanded. "You've brought me Valentine flowers, manufactured a row from a tiny problem, and then you tell me you don't want to be with me any longer. What the fuck is this about?" A sudden explanation entered my mind. Is this just getting back at me for what fucking happened 3 years ago? Did I really hurt you that much? Is that what this is? Despite Tom's persistent denials, I still found it hard to believe that a man could arrive at my door with chocolates and flowers and split up with me immediately afterwards because of the smallest of disagreements. It felt messed up and wrong, and the rejection upset me deeply. We never spoke again. My first breakup with Tom was to have ramifications for beyond the temporary heartbreak and loss of my first serious boyfriend. For a couple of years, my relationship with my grandparents had been easier because of my friendship with a boy they had liked, a boy from what they believed to have been a respectable family. My grandmother in particular had stopped worrying about me being out late or not letting her know where I had been, because she assumed that I was in locus parentis care of Tom's mother. The irony is that while she believed my moral welfare was being safeguarded by Tom's mom, I was spending entire nights introducing her son to my very own brand of kinky and dominant sex. Once Tom was off the scene, however, family relationships spiraled rapidly downhill. Life at home with my grandparents turned into a nightmare for all of us. Many years later, some years before they died, I apologized to them with all my heart for the heartache I had caused them as a teenager. I had never stopped loving them and had always understood that they loved me deeply. They in turn apologized for the sometimes clumsy way they had tried to raise a rebellious granddaughter. Both of us recognizing that none of us had been trying to hurt the other. It was just a situation tailor-made for confrontation. I like to think that by then we had both come to terms with what had happened in my teenage years. I loved them then, and still to this day, miss them with all of my heart. The truth is that I never set out to be naughty, but in my search for teenage independence, I hit the brick wall of a serious generation gap. My grandparents' expectations of what I should and should not be doing were wildly outdated when compared to those of my peers. Speaking now to my birth month, long after the deaths both of my grandparents, she admits how poorly equipped they were to handle the situation. I was nothing like an angel, but many of our rows at the time sprang from their complete lack of understanding that teenagers are hardwired to push against the barriers as they grow older. My granddad tried to stay out of most of our confrontations, but my grandmother and I had a lot of screaming rows, like mega screaming rows, pretty much always over me not being home. I used to go to school in the week, but then at the weekend I would go out clubbing, and I was working. I had a job in a chemist's, and I would go out on a Saturday night and then come home on the Sunday. If I said to my grandmother, "Oh, I am going to be out till late tonight," she would have one stock reaction: "Where are you going to be? Who are you seeing? Where is the phone number? I need to ring them." "Oh no, oh, you are not embarrassing me like that." And ringing everybody all the time, "Sorry. And no, I'm not telling you where I'll be, because I'm not having you turn up there." By this time, past my 16th birthday, but was still being told that I had to obey a 7 p.m. curfew each night. I was a stubborn young woman, and the more they tried to be strict, the more they tried to interfere in my life, the more stubborn I became. One constant bone of contention was the privacy I could expect in the house. My grandmother would tell me she did not want me out walking the streets, but then would deny my privacy at home. It was impossible to have a private phone call without them overhearing or asking who I was speaking to, and if I brought somebody home, she would constantly walk into my room. "You are so over the top," I would say. Every 5 minutes I get, "Do you want a cup of tea? Do you want this or do you want that?" If I want a cup of tea, I'll come down and get one, or ask you. Just use any excuse possible to get into my room and invade my privacy. I'm here, sitting in the house. You know where I am, and you're still on my case. Quite often when we had screaming rows, they would end with my stomping out of the house and slamming the door, or I would just stay upstairs and stick my music up full blast, just to piss them off. I know it was bad behavior, but it was born from frustration, total frustration. A lot of the time I wasn't even doing anything particularly naughty. Sometimes it would be nothing other than hanging around in the local park with friends, but I would still get the third degree when I got home. I no longer had a boyfriend, and although I was seeing guys occasionally, I was always immensely careful not to get pregnant. There were odd occasions, few and far between, when like all teenagers, I would get horribly drunk with friends, but because I had very little money, drinking and drugs didn't figure much in my life. Yet nothing I could say would persuade my grandmother to cut me any slack. There were times when my birth mother would try to act as a peacemaker and tell me to behave. I'm sure that my grandmother would plead for her help because after some particularly horrendous argument, Ellen would come on the phone to talk to me. She would frequently lay a guilt trip on me in an effort to change my attitude. Your grandparents aren't going to be here forever. You have to try and get along with them. They are doing the best they can, you know. They are a different generation. You have to understand that one day they will be gone, and you will feel bad for not getting on with them. Was all very well her coming the heavy parent over the phone. It might have had more effect had she been there in person. It's clear to me now that much of the reason why my grandparents tried to be so strict with me was that they had already brought up one daughter, my birth mother, who had gone off the rails in spectacular fashion by getting pregnant at such a young age. Although they never discussed it with me directly, I think my grandmother in particular must deep down have felt guilty that she had allowed that to happen. The outcome was that they tried to correct what they saw as their earlier mistakes by keeping an even closer control over me. I would constantly say, "Don't worry, I'm not that stupid to have a child, so don't worry about that." The truth was that I had never planned on having kids, didn't want to get married, wasn't interested in children at all, so I used to throw that at them all of the time. I am not the same as your daughter. Do not think I am going to have a child. I have no intention of having a child. The last thing on earth I want is to have a child. They never talked to me about the trauma of the time when their daughter got pregnant. It was a subject that was impossible for us to have ever discussed. I could never raise the issue with them because anything that even hinted about me not being their real daughter was terrifying for them to talk about. It was almost as though an open admission that I did have a birth mother would somehow take me away from being their child. Because I loved them so much, it was the one thing I could never do to them. The irony is, my birth mother was only too happy to talk about it. Whenever I saw her whilst I was growing up through my teenage years, she would often tell me how she would never have left me with anybody else other than my grandparents. Blah, blah, blah. That she knew they would love and care for me. Blah, blah, blah. It reached a point where I used to hate seeing her sometimes because I wasn't interested in hearing her story, but she clearly had a need to tell me all of the time and bring the subject up. On every possible occasion, I would be thinking, I don't want to know. You don't have to bring it up every time. I am not interested. I don't want to talk about it. Partly for that reason, I never built a strong relationship with my birth mother, and a blazing family row one Christmas in my early teens led to a long-term break with Eileen, a row that stopped the two of us communicating with each other for years. According to a survey, a typical British family has an average of 5 domestic rows between the time when the kids wake up to see if Santa has been, and the end of the Queen's afternoon address to her nation. Unfortunately, my family was no exception to the rule. As is often the way with Christmas, the dispute began with the smallest and silliest of words and rapidly escalated from a border skirmish to a loud thermonuclear war. After a traditional lunch, with traditional quantities of booze for all the adults, I was playing a light-hearted game of cards with my grandfather and my birth mother's husband. After losing the 5th hand in a row, I foolishly made what was meant to be nothing more than a joke That someone is cheating around here. Who's hiding all the cards? The effect on the winning high roller, my birth mother's husband, was startling. He jumped to his feet and started shouting at me. "How dare you say something like that?" he screamed. As he yelled into my face, I at first tried to say it had been merely a bit of banter, but then soon ended up giving him as good a tirade of swear words as I was getting in return. Both of us were becoming more heated by the second, but I was still astonished when he suddenly leaned over and pushed me backwards against my chair. I rocked from the unexpected shove, but managed to keep my balance and stay on my feet. I may not have been physically hurt, but my teenage pride had taken a battering, and my tongue went into overdrive. "How dare you? How fucking dare you push me like that? Who the fuck do you think you are?" I was in full, admittedly foul-mouthed flow when he suddenly pushed me again, so hard this time that I fell over the chair and went sprawling on the floor. Now incandescent with rage, I was cursing like the proverbial trooper when my birth mother rushed into the room to see what was causing such chaos and commotion. The remains of the day and our always strained relationship might still been salvaged if she had just been willing to listen to my side of the story, but that was never an option. She was only interested in the fact that I was swearing at her husband, not that he had knocked me over in a silly row about a game of cards. Not interested in what I had to say at all. Already angry and upset, it was easy for much of my rage to instantly transfer to my birth mother. "How fucking dare you?" thought. "It's unbelievable. I make a joke and he behaves like that and puts his hands on me. And all she's interested in is the language I'm using." I was so disappointed in her, so disappointed that she was more interested in the language I was using in retaliation than in the fact that her husband had sent me flying across the room. I no longer remember how the row ended that day, whether I left or they left, but the result was the same either way. I could not help but feel rejected once again by the one woman I might have hoped would stand up by my side. My real mother and I had nothing more to say to each other. Even in retrospect, I find it impossible to judge now how much hidden resentment from the past events of my childhood fed into my feelings that day and over the year or more that followed. Perhaps the row was another nail in the coffin. All I know is that I felt so betrayed that it caused a long-lasting rift. 2 months later, a birthday card containing money in lieu of a present arrived from my birth mother. I ripped the card into pieces, left the money untouched in the envelope and sent it back. Return to sender. Chapter 13. Leaving home. It was a shocking telephone call for me to overhear. A few half-whispered words that were to destroy the security of the only home I had ever known, and leave me homeless, penniless, and without a family to depend upon. My grandmother was in the front hall, speaking with the local social services department and trying to arrange for me to be taken into care. I had never planned to eavesdrop on her. I had just slipped into the house quietly and crept upstairs so as not to disturb my grandparents. Then I heard her one-sided telephone conversation. "But surely you have to take her into care if we can't cope. She's only just 16 and anyway, what difference does her age make?" Single quotes. It is hard to describe how I felt when the hammer blow understanding of what my grandmother was discussing struck home. I was horrified and deeply upset. Silent tears were running down my cheeks and, in the quietness of my upstairs bedroom, felt more rejected than ever before. It was, of course, a situation I had provoked through my own behavior, but nothing could take away from the fact that this was the only loving mother I had ever known, now trying to have me removed from her life. I had no real concept of what being taken into care meant other than that it was the sort of thing that happened to girls whose parents had died, or been sent to prison, or who had been so bad themselves that they had to be locked up in a council home. The fear of losing the security of my own house, the comfort of my own tiny bedroom, the love of my grandparents, and the stigma of council care simply overwhelmed me. Within seconds, I regressed from being a feisty, lippy, sometimes foul-mouthed teenager to a little girl who desperately wanted her mummy. Lean back on that day now, I understand exactly how close to the edge I must have driven my poor grandparents for them to make such a decision. As a teenager, however, full of the fake bravado of youth, desperately trying to learn an adult independence, I could see no explanation at all. As fast as my fears had grown and my tears had flowed, the shock was replaced with an ice-cold anger. I heard you. I heard who you were talking to, I shouted to my astonished grandmother as I flew down the stairs. You bitch. You cold-hearted, deceitful, hateful fucking bitch. Even by the standards of the monumental rows we had on a regular basis. My language was cruel and unfair, but driven by a mix of anger and fear. How could you do that? If you just want me to go, you only had to ask, not go sneaking off to get me taken away. Startled because she had not known I was even in the house, my grandmother did her best to defend herself from an attack which must have arrived out of the blue. It's your fault, Miranda. You've driven us to this. We just can't cope with you anymore. It's too hard to try and look after you, and you don't make anything easy. The row was short and sharp and bitter, and, not surprising in the circumstances, deteriorated rapidly into my foul-mouthed rant and my grandmother's embarrassed but angry defense. My grandfather must have been in the house, but I cannot remember him saying anything at all as I stomped upstairs, banging doors, and finally throwing a few clothes into a rucksack. As I tried to pick what things I could pack, I heard my grandmother making another call, this time to my birth mother, trying to explain what was happening. It made no difference to me. If my adoptive mom and dad didn't want me, I certainly wasn't going to take advice from the woman who had given me away. By the time I clumped my way downstairs again, there was nothing left for any of us to say. Neither of my grandparents said or did anything to stop me leaving. I was 16. I had no money, few clothes with me, no idea where I might stay, and no family left to whom I might turn. As I angrily slammed out of the front door, I was, for the first time in my life, truly on my own. My grandmother had hit an insuperable problem in the telephone call she made attempting to place me in care. Being over 16 meant that the local authority had no responsibility to take me into care or to offer me any support. If she had made the call just a few months earlier, when I was still 15, then she might have had more success. Clearly now, I was going to get no help from officialdom. The truth is that I would not have known how to access any such assistance, even were it there to be offered. Standing on the pavement outside of the house I had lived in forever, I had not a clue where I could go. Still angry, wandered the streets for a while, then used some of the little money I had to call a girl with whom I had been working in my Saturday job at a local chemist shop. I have no idea what I told her, but although we hardly knew each other outside of that job, she was kind enough to let me stay on her sofa for a few nights. In fact, I was to stay with her several times in the months to come, although always being careful to find somewhere else to move to at regular intervals so as to give her some respite from my temporary presence in her flat. Another friend, Julie, also offered me a sofa to sleep on. She lived not far from where my present-day dungeon is located, and unlike my first temporary refuge, she did have the benefit of central heating. After many winters of freezing in my grandparents' home, that was, for me, a luxury beyond measure. The downside of being with Julie, apart from the awkwardness of living on a sofa and out of a suitcase, was that she was in the process of separating from her husband, and he clearly resented my presence in her life. I was desperate to find somewhere else to live, and then found the answer in being asked out for a drink by a guy who lived rent-free in a London squat. At that time, I was mostly definitely not dressing to impress potential boyfriends. The fashion was all for baggy trousers with even baggier tops. But I knew I was a pretty young woman, and the guy asking me out was more than passable. He was fit and muscular, a bodybuilder, and the sort of guy who did turn me on. He was never going to be a permanent partner in life, but moving in with him temporarily would ease my growing accommodation problem and give me a boyfriend of sorts. As well, he worked part-time as a bouncer. His squat was rough and ready on one of the worst council block estates in London, but my choices were strictly limited. I moved in. To say that my new home was in a rough part of town would be a monumental understatement. Half of the flats were boarded up. No stones had been left unthrown in breaking plenty of windows, and it was the type of neighborhood where even policemen feared to tread. The outside walls of each flat must once have been white, but the little peeling paint that remained had long since turned to 50 shades of dingy gray. By early evening, the time when I would arrive there from school, young gang members were hanging out on every corner. I would sometimes watch from my window as the occasional passers-by foolish enough to walk through the estate were subjected to a barrage of catcalls and threats from this weird, drug-addicted boys' brigade. Whatever danger my family had feared I was in from going out late-night clubbing was as nothing compared to the dangers I faced once I left the security of their home. My new friend's flat was on the first floor, and so it involved a trudge up a staircase, strewn with litter and reeking of the smell of fresh urine and stale disinfectant which the council would splash around more in hope than expectation of improving the environment. I would often get off of the bus in the nearby high street and walk past those yellow police notices, appealing for information about an incident which had occurred a night or two before. There must have been times when they ran out of signboards. Most of the incidents were muggings, or stabbings, or gang fights of one kind or another, and as I and my boyfriend were just about the only white people living on the entire estate, I could not but help feel vulnerable. I was always thinking, oh God, please don't let me get any problems tonight. We may not be talking New York ghetto here, but being barely 16 years old, with no family who wanted to know me, and living in a place like that, really rammed home to me how alone in the world I truly was. Amazingly, despite my constant nervousness, I was never bothered by anyone, a fact I put down to my boyfriend being a bodybuilder whose sheer muscle power earned him a grudging respect on the mean streets where we lived. The other odd thing was that the flat itself, an illegal squat for which nobody paid rent, was actually a clean and decent home. It had central heating, believe it or not, and some carpets, windows, and even a working oven. A previous tenant had left the flat partly furnished, and my friend had reached an agreement to pay the utility bills so that it still had running water, gas, and electricity. It was almost like having a two-bedroomed flat on split levels, with an upstairs and a downstairs. On one of my first nights alone in the flat, my attempts to do English literature homework were interrupted by a commotion outside. I saw scores of uniformed policemen sneaking along the wall and then converging in a rush on the building below. They rammed open the door, and soon afterwards dragged out a group of guys with all of the accompanying chaos and noise that you could possibly imagine. I was thinking, oh bloody hell, nobody even knows where I am at the moment. Anything could happen. Somebody could break the door in, and I'm here on my own. I felt entirely alone and vulnerable. When the guy I was staying with got home, breathlessly told him the news. Big deal. What's the problem? It's a crack house down there. They raid it all the time. One opens up on the estate. They raid it, shut it down, and another opens up across the way. It was a sobering thought. This was not the place for homework, and I had to live here and get to and from my school each day. Life was going to be challenging. My nights with the bodybuilder had already turned into a sexual relationship, although it was clear we were never going to be a dedicated couple. One opens up on the estate. They raid it, shut it down, and another opens up across the way. It was a sobering thought. This was not the place for homework, and I had to live here and get to and from my school each day. Life was going to be challenging. My nights with the bodybuilder had already turned into a sexual relationship, although it was clear we were never going to be a dedicated couple. In many ways, it was a shag of convenience for both of us. I was 16 and legal now, although he was at least twice my age. Even so, he had a great bung. A bodybuilder's muscles in places where many men don't even have muscles, and was certainly a lot better endowed than the earlier teenage love of my life. He also had a car, so could sometimes save me a 3-bus journey by dropping me at school in the mornings or picking me up after classes. He had no problem with me staying with him, but also made it clear he did not want me living there full time. He already had a steady girlfriend who used to turn up occasionally, and other women as well. I never minded because I was not looking for romance. This was just a place to stay, and I never minded making myself scarce when he had other company for the night. The downside was that I could never unpack my small bag of clothing and the few bits and pieces that comprised my entire worldly possessions. I would never know who might be in the squat on the 3 or 4 nights a week when I couldn't stay. As a consequence, I lived a nomadic life out of the rucksack, moving between school, work, the squat, the flat where my friend from the chemist lived, and the occasional night on other friends' sofas. The biggest difficulty of all was getting the money on which to live. I had mostly free accommodation, but I still needed to feed myself, buy some clothing, pay for my bus fares, and just have some money for day-to-day survival. Work was nothing new to me. I had always had a job of some sort to supplement the tiny amount of pocket money which was all that my grandparents could afford to give me. I'd done a paper round, worked in shops, in a bakery, and lots of other things. They were all such crap jobs. And the one thing I did know was that I wanted more out of life than that. I used to look at the people I was working with in some boring shop job and think to myself, this is their whole life. How terrible it must be to have no education and be stuck in a job like this, not just for a Saturday or one evening a week, but for your whole life. I knew that wasn't going to happen to me. The irony was that the only way that I could now support myself and stay at school was to take more of those same crap jobs from which I was so desperate to escape. So got a job cleaning offices in the morning before school, and another job cleaning houses at the end of each school day. Then at weekends I managed to get work in a local chemist shop which was close enough for me to cycle to on Saturdays, and on a couple of afternoons after school. Between classroom and work, there wasn't time for any sort of social life, and the only light on my horizon was that I was finally earning enough from my multiple jobs routine to be able to afford a room of my own. I said goodbye to the squat and moved into a tiny bedroom in a shared, terraced house in West London. I still drive past the house most days now on my way to work at my far more spacious dungeons nearby. One of my abiding memories of living there is that I didn't have the faintest idea of how to cook anything. It wasn't only a lack of money which forced me into eating little more than plain rice and vegetables. I was scared of poisoning myself, because I had no idea of how to tell if meat of any sort was properly cooked or not. To meet the rent payments, I added yet another job, working as a gardener. During the long summer school holidays, a small gardening company employed me to water the flowers and mow lawns for well-off residents in grander, detached houses in a somewhat posher nearby neighborhood. I often mowed the lawn in my bikini, which may have helped my employment prospects, although the company owner was a perfect gentleman who never took advantage of my admittedly skimpy work attire. The one thing he did take advantage of, however, was my fledgling business skills and my ability to type. I had done business studies and sociology at school, and my boss was studying part-time for an MISC, which meant he was grateful for help in typing out his essays. He paid me extra to type for him, but then gradually began accepting my input on various aspects of his studies that related to my own schoolwork. It caused some jealousy with some of the other employees because he would sometimes leave them doing the hard labor gardening work while I worked with him on whatever essay he was preparing that week. I couldn't really understand their resentment. They knew I was surviving hand to mouth on my own end, yet they still begrudged me trying to better myself and earn a little more cash in my hand. It was an attitude I had never come across before, but oddly enough, one I was soon to encounter from a radically different source. The trained and highly paid pharmacist in the chemist shop where I worked part-time seemed to delight in belittling my own ambitions to get to university. By my standards, he was seriously wealthy, with a large home in a posh London suburb and children attending a fee-paying public school. He obviously thought of me as nothing but a shopgirl and openly laughed when I said I was studying to get to uni. "You haven't got the qualifications," he teased. "You'll never get to university, so why are you looking through all of these books? You may as well accept your lot in life and stop dreaming." When I tried to tell him I had 8 GZs and was studying for A-levels, he brushed me aside. "Look to what you can get and be happy with that," he advised. We clashed on a lot of things, not least the fact that he was so mean. He tried to charge me for using too many tissues from a box when I arrived at work with a heavy cold. He paid me just £2.25 an hour, but would want to deduct wages if I turned up even a few moments late. Now I was determined to speak up for myself. "Listen," told him angrily, "if it's anyone that's going to amount to anything, it's going to be me, not your kids. They've got everything on a plate, the background and the education, because they get it all from you. They've never had to fight or work hard or anything. My parents don't have a penny, but I'll tell you now, one day, going to walk back into your shop and show you my certificates." It was, of course, the sort of empty threat we all make in anger, but years later, I did find myself walking past the same shop and was sorely tempted to run back home, grab my degree papers, stick them under his nose, and say, "See, fuck you, you were wrong." Despite our arguments, my boss's dismissive comments probably helped by spurring me on to even greater efforts to cope with my overbusy life. I also believe that he did slowly develop a grudging respect for me. One day, not long before I left for good, he admitted he had considered firing me for speaking out about his kids. "The truth is, I fucking can't stand you because you give me mouth," he said. "But I can't fault your work. You're honest, and you're a hard worker. And that's the only reason I didn't sack you then, and wouldn't sack you now." The necessity to work hard at both school and in several jobs meant that I had no time for much fun or for boys. I had become virtually celibate, which was an odd thing because whenever I did have a boyfriend, it had been me that had taken the lead in the bedroom. In the right circumstances, I was the one who made the advances, hunted men down, and generally ended up getting the guy on his back. One friend laughingly described me once as a lust bucket, a bubbling bucket of lust. Now, I was living like a nun, perhaps surprisingly for someone who has worked for the past 2 decades. In the adult industry, there are a number of relatively common sexual games that I have never got round to playing. In some cases, it is simply because the activity does not appeal to me. In others, life has just never taken me in that particular direction. So I have never been to a swingers party, never partner swapped, never had a bisexual relationship, never really been to any amateur orgy, and my only attempt, so far, at a threesome proved to be something on an unmitigated disaster. When I use the word threesome, I should stress that I am talking of a male-male, female variety, a man sandwich rather than most men's fantasy, to women with one guy. Not being at all bisexual, although happy to play that part for professional purposes, the idea of another woman and I competing over a man holds no appeal whatsoever. My threesome fail came not long after a new man moved into the upstairs room above my flat. I wasn't involved in any sort of romantic relationship at the time and was too tired to have any interest in finding one. But my new neighbor, Simon, seemed pleasant enough. Living in the same small house, we slowly got to know each other a little better. He was really into smoking weed, as cannabis was known then, and we shared a little one night. I can't quite remember exactly how that transformed into us sleeping together, but it seems to have been our only mutual interest. We both knew, however, that our friendship was never going to be the love match of our lives. It was never going to get serious. Not long afterwards, though, Simon moved in with me mainly because he was always finding it hard to pay the rent, and by moving into my bed, he could give up his room upstairs and cut his living expenses. The downside was that we couldn't let the landlord know of our new, shared sleeping arrangements. Simon virtually gave up using the front entrance, and it became a common sight to see him hopping in and out of my ground floor bedroom window at all hours of the day or night. We were only together for a couple of months, and truth was, Simon was clearly a bit of an oddball from the start. On one occasion, he took me to meet his mother, who lived on a council estate nearby, and I was surprised to find that she was smoking puff as well during the whole time we were there. I also knew that he was always poking around in my things when I was out at work. I had a small desk in the corner, and things on the shelves would have been moved slightly, where he would ask me questions about people whom I knew he could never have met and could only ever have known about from pictures he must have seen by flicking through the photos albums that I kept in a box in my wardrobe. So, there were some odd signs there, but when I confronted him about it, he told me I was being paranoid. He loved to talk about my sex life and ask me about everything I had done in the past and any games that I might like to try in the future. I suppose we were both just putting out feelers to see how this new relationship might work. He said he was interested in getting into my head and discovering what, sexually, would work for me. One night I mentioned that I had never been involved in a threesome, but that I might be up for it if the second guy was interesting enough. Shortly afterwards, he brought a friend round to the flat, and it was clear exactly what was on both of their minds. Simon and I ended up making love while his friend was still in the room watching, and then the friend moved onto our bed and tried to join in. I was starting to think that this might be fun, but then it all went a little pear-shaped. I was up for playing. Simon was still keen, but his friends' nerves let him down. It was soon clear that there were never going to be 2 erections available in my bed that night, and that nothing much was ever going to happen. As threesomes go, it was all a bit of a failure. Oddly enough, after encouraging me to have sex with another man, Simon gradually grew more and more jealous and started to accuse me, wrongly, of eyeing up his friends. His obsession culminated in a violent shouting row during which he pushed me across the room. Furious at being physically attacked, I did some shouting of my own, and he pushed me again before screaming, "You want to hit me, don't you? Come on then, hit me." So I did. My punch to his face hurt my knuckles, but also hurt Simon. His teeth pushed into his lip, and he started bleeding, but it didn't stop him fighting. Throwing himself at me, Simon grabbed hold of my shoulders and then bit my face, just below my right eye. I could not believe what he had done. I think the violence of biting me shocked Simon as well, and he just turned and ran from the room. I was left in a state of shock. It was the first time that I had ever been attacked in that way. After cleaning myself up a little, I realized that he could return to the flat at any time, and that for safety's sake, and to try and prevent him attacking another woman like that, I really ought to tell the police what had happened. The upshot was that I did go to the local police station and reported the assault. They took down all the details, called in a photographer, and took pictures of my swollen black eye. The police at that time, however, consistently failed to take much interest in what they saw as domestic violence, and so, although they did question him about the assault, no charges were ever laid. They said that the photographs and records would be kept on file in case he ever attacked me again, but he never bothered me after that night. Although I was not really scared of him coming back, I was left in a slight state of shock. For the next week or so, I was trying to work with bruises and a highly visible black eye, and although I had my friend Sharon in the building, I had nobody really close that I could talk to. There are times in life when you need the comfort and reassurance that only your closest family can offer, and for me, that was not an option. Although I had become reconciled with my grandparents after the bitterness surrounding my departure from their house, I knew that I couldn't turn up on their door with my face looking battered and bruised. After moving out of their home, I found that I could always pop round for a chat. They would cook me dinner, be happy to see me, and even sometimes insist that I stay overnight. I loved them, and they loved me. We just could not live together. They were always anxious about me. They were now old and somewhat frail, and I didn't want to burden them with my troubles. On top of that, I had at That time completely lost touch with my birth mother following the angry words that had been spoken during our horrendous row, a situation compounded by not having a phone. Meantime, although I tried my best to get to school each day, it was probably inevitable that with my erratic lifestyle, my studies would suffer. Plain exhaustion and the strain of traveling so far each day was taking its toll. Sometimes I simply didn't have the money to pay for my bus fare, and if I had been staying on the sofa with friends, I'd often get woken in the early hours when they came home from all-night clubbing. Soon I was being bombarded with complaints from teachers. In desperation, I fixed up a meeting at school to explain that I was no longer living at home and that things were difficult, but with the exception of just one of the teachers, nobody much seemed to care. Still, I persevered as best I could, getting to classes whenever possible, completing assignments and handing in essays. For all of my subjects, media studies, English literature, and geography, it was the pick and mix of subjects that I hoped would offer a reasonable chance of fulfilling an ambition to work in television, newspapers, or films when I finally graduated from whichever university would accept me. I knew my teachers were unhappy, but what came next was a devastating blow, right out of the blue. As I stepped up my workload in preparation for taking my A-level examinations, I was called to a meeting. With no consultation, and seemingly with no right of appeal, I was told that the school would not be entering me for the exams in 3 of my subjects. My media studies teacher was the only one who had stood up for me and insisted that the examination should go ahead. The others had refused exam entry, presumably scared that I would fail and lower their all-important percentage pass rates and cost them school league table places. I was overflowing with anger. It was a terrible betrayal. I was working so hard, and they all knew I was, to all intents and purposes, homeless. To make their cowardice worse, nobody had even told me that much of my work had been pointless because they had not entered me for the exams. I was left crying in the classroom where my media studies teacher was the only one who tried to comfort me. He was the unsung hero who constantly encouraged me to persevere with my plans for university even though his colleagues had all written me off. The only remaining possibility was for me to pay the fee to enter the examinations without the backing of the school. Living hand to mouth on poor wages from multiple part-time jobs meant that it was never going to be a realistic option. Throughout my school life, I had always come near to the top of the class. I knew I had the ability to rapidly absorb and regurgitate information in order to sail through earlier examinations with far less preparation than I had completed for these. But nothing I said made any difference, and in the end, I sat just one of my 4 intended subjects. I passed media studies with an A, but my hopes of becoming the first person within my family to attend a university was fast fading to a distant dream. It was one of my scariest moments. The idea of not completing my education, of being stuck in a dead-end job, everything I had striven so hard to avoid, was in danger of becoming my future after all. Not, I resolved, if I had anything to do with it. Finding my way into university at first seemed impossible, but I set about contacting every possible college that might accept me. Eventually I found one of the newer universities offering an ancient course, with the option of staying on an extra year and earning a full degree. My set of GZs and my solitary A-level would be enough to get me in the door, which left only 2 problems. The need to find somewhere new to live within striking distance of the university campus and finding the money to survive for 3 more years of study, and determined to add to my already tiring quota of jobs to find the cash. But looking for a room to rent when every trip was at the mercy of London bus timetables was proving a serious challenge. I was still in close and loving contact with my grandparents, but they had no money and, more importantly, no car to help me go bedsit hunting. There was only one other possibility of help. I swallowed my pride and telephoned my birth mother.